Okay, so today we're going to show you a little bit on the Atlas to where we are. Also got a few other things coming up. We've got the A65. I'm going to show you on that how you shim up the crank before you reassemble the engine. Then we got the gearbox on the bench, which is the RR22 gearbox out the Gold Star. We're going to take that apart because I've already taken the engine apart, which is here. We're going to run through this and show you what we found. We haven't cleaned it up, so you'll see how it is and what's not quite right with it. So quite interesting. Also in the background behind we have an RGS Rocket Gold Star, which is a genuine one. It has been laid up for a while. It just needs a little bit of recommissioning. It's now running. It needs a good clean. So we're going to use our products on this and we're going to get this all up and shiny. We're going to use these products here. XCP. Now I haven't used these before and I'm told they are very good, so we will find out what sort of condition we can get this back into. It is at the moment a little bit tired. It has suffered a little bit, not badly, but it'd be nice to get the wheels cleaned up, the cases, the engine, and a bit of shine back on it. We're cleaning this bike up because this bike is going to be sold to the customer. It's a same old story. Someone's got older and it's too much for him, and he's had it a number of years, and yeah, it needs a new home, but it has got matching numbers. It is a proper RGS and it's quite a nice one. It's not going to go for silly money, so when we got it all up together, we'll run it up today for you so you can hear it, but when it's all totally finished then we'll show you more detail what we got it to. We can show you the engine as it is now. It looks a little bit how can I say, doesn't shine. That's all I can say really, but mechanically it's good. So right, so what we're going to do now, we're going to go straight on to just recap on this, onto the Atlas. Now the Atlas is virtually ready to go. I just need to retime this magneto because it's got this 4-spark set up now in the mag, and it's slightly over advanced. I mentioned before about it's not easy to set that up, but we use a little tiny tank here of fuel because then we can set the carburetors up. But it's a nice attractive bike, and when that's running we set the carbs up, we put the tank back on, the seat on, and then we can get the bike out and we can do a bit of a road test on it. But it's virtually there now. Nice looking machine, as I said before, quite powerful, and so I can't do this one today because I need to take the timing case cover off and I'll undo the mag gear, and I'll then turn the whole shaft with the rotor on in the magneto and reposition it. It's just slightly over advanced. I mentioned to you before about the A65, why I took it apart, because it really wanted to rebore. And we mentioned about the con rods. We measured these up and they're slightly stretched. They can stretch and you can get these rods rocking on the journals. This is a replacement rod. This is what I've been waiting for. These are the Thunder rods. Billet aluminium, really nice rods. So they're gonna, don't have a bush anymore, it's straight into the billet aluminium. So they're going to be put on the crank. The most important thing before you put your rods back onto your crankshaft is, with an A65 as standard, has a bush on the timing side and a bearing on the drive side. Most important thing is to put the cases together, and you need to shim to get rid of the end float, but you mustn't get rid of it completely to where the bearing is pre-loaded when the cases go back together. That needs to run nice and easy, nice and smooth.
Explain what end float is.
End float is when the crankshaft will move backwards and forwards. So if I was to get hold of this crank and push it, you will physically see the shaft move out of the case on this side, and I'll pull back there to move. You don't want that movement. The reason is, it's not good for the bearings anyway. It all needs to run straight. It needs to be centered, this crankshaft. You don't want the crank moving like this because it means the con rods will be loaded like that backwards and forwards. So important to get everything set up smoothly and be balanced. Now the crank at the moment, you can see it runs quite easy in there. What you'll find, there's no sealant on here, so you need your cases nice and clean. And we're going to take it apart now because it has been shimmed. I've compensated for the sealer because we'll use well seal on here, and that will relieve that tight tolerance. It will be slightly, very marginally slimmer, sorry, not quite such a close fit, so that will relieve that bearing a little bit more. But what we do now is we just take these cases apart again. Need to do bits of wood. What we do is undo the bolts on this side. We leave one bolt in place, we turn it on its side, and this will be on the bench, and we can take this top case off. So we're just going to do that now for you. When you're checking for this crank, you don't need to over tighten these nuts.
How much does the well seal increase?
Depends how thick it's on there, really. You're probably looking at between half a foul and a foul, probably half a foul, I'd imagine. Right, got those. There should be 3 down here. Yep. And there's some washers underneath, actually, so we just get the washers out.
And where do you get your shims?
Shims you can buy boxes of shims, various thicknesses. I've got, a load of shims in boxes, but you can through Kidderminster, for instance, because they supply the parts to the engine, they have a selection of shims, so you can buy a selection pack, and then you can use which ones you need. That's really the best bet. So I've taken these inner nuts off here. Sorry, just now. When I put these cases together, I just screwed the nuts straight up onto the case. I didn't put the washers in because the washers grip the aluminium, and I didn't need to do that. All I'm really checking for is squeezing up the cases to get rid of the end float. So I'd done this last week, so I'm sorry I just didn't mention that. So we're just going to undo these 2 outer nuts. I'm going to leave this one on here loose because I'm going to turn this whole thing up the other way in a moment. But it's so important to get your end float sorted out, to eliminate end float and not to have the crank too tight in the cases.
How will you know what's a telltale sign if you've done it wrong?
You'll bolt this up, and that's the way you want your journals in, your con rods on your journals. You'll bolt it up and it'll go tight. You don't want that. You want it so that when it's bolted up, it still spins and it will fall back. So when we do this, it will come back. If it doesn't and it's a job to turn, you got it wrong. And if it's like this and you can move it backwards and forwards, let's just show you. For instance, if we just part these cases a little bit, this will accentuate it, but just going to try and just okay. So when you put it together, the crank back and the cases, you might bolt it all up tight. Don't look at the gap now, and you might have this. And this is why we put the shims in. And I'll show you where you put the shims. That's end float. That's just showing you what you could have with the cases pressed up tight. I just undone these cases to show you what you can possibly have. You don't want to build the engine up with that movement in the crank. You don't want that moving about when it's running, because like I say, the rods will be doing this, and the bearing isn't doing its job properly. That running surface there is going in and out the bush. That isn't correct. So what we're doing now, we'll just take this one off and we'll flip it over, take that one off.
So So this is on A65, is it similar process for any other one?
No, unit construction, it's just really, it's not, yeah, okay, it's something that you get with other engines as well. This is the A65, so you have the bush, so it would be the same with the A10. So the A10 would be exactly the same because the crank build up in the crankcase is the same really. Let me just get it a little bit safer than that first. That's it. Okay, so go back to camera now. Turn the case over so your timing side is in the upward position. Because this is on the bush, we want to lift this off the bush. So then we can just take out this last nut on the case. And this should just lift up. Just give it a little bit of a tap. Just pull it up carefully because of the bush. Now what we're going to mention in a moment is about the gearbox, the importance of putting the sprocket back on at this stage. We get back to the crankshaft, so now the crank will show you there's two things here you've got to be careful of. It's getting the end float correct, also this shim. Now this shim, this thrust bearing rather, I should say this end, this sits in this side of the case, on this side, but it sits in only one way. Now I have known people, by mistake, to get it wrong. They fitted it like that, but it should be like this. Now the crank itself, just now, will lift out of the bearing. Lift it straight up and out. Now we can see the shims have come away. So there the shims go, is on here. They fit on there like that. I've measured this. So what you do each time is you take your bearing. Usually this part of the bearing usually stays on the crankshaft. Let's just lift him out. This has all been like, this is all done before we do the assembly. When we do the assembly, we're cleaning everything down. This is just purely to get rid of your end float and sort yourself out really to where you're going to go. So it's important to get this bearing on the crankshaft correctly. Now this side of the bearing's got like a flange, and sometimes it has writing on it, but it does vary. It happens to be on the outside on this bearing here. It's important that that part of the flange goes onto the shims. We're very careful with the crankshaft. We don't want to reduce the tolerances here of the bearing, but it should slide on. It should go up against the shims. Like we've shown you just now, it's so important now. Like we put the shims back on and we know this is correct, but we're just going to show you want to be so careful when you lift this back in. And when you do your assembly, you want to put lots of oil around here. You have your well seal on this part of the case, and then we offer it to the bearing. And you want to make sure when you go down into the bearing, you get it in correctly. Like that. And then that's why we use a little bit of grease on this thrust washer to hold it in the case. Then we put that onto the crankshaft. What I'm going to show you now is we have reassembled the gearbox cassette. Now when you put your sprocket back on the sleeve gear and you have your washer and your nut, The way I do it, as I do it at this stage, I don't put the two cases together anymore and use I have got a grip device that I can use to hold the sprocket, but I find the best way, get a chain wrench, which is the right pitch, and you can put that on there, and that will hold that in place. In that case now it's undoing it. Put it round the other way.
Why do you do it up now, Dave?
Sorry?
Why do you do it up now?
Because when it's in place, it's such a job to get this tight. Now I have means now of getting a big adjustable spanner on there or a socket, and I can hold this. I can hold the sprocket with the chain wrench and it won't move. Now I can get a good spanner on there, and then I can just bend over the tab washer afterwards. Right, so on the Gold Star we haven't got the RRT2 gearbox, we've got a standard ratio gearbox. It's much the same really. The components inside are very similar. It's really only the bearings. In this case it would be bushes instead of needle bearings, and you can see how it comes apart. So removing the gear lever, moving the kickstart lever. This cover is just access to normally your course adjuster for the clutch. It's on the spline here, but we just take this off anyway.
We loosened these before, didn't we?
Yeah. You probably have this loose anyway when you're taking the cable out. And you have through the centre of the main shaft in the gearbox, you have the long push rod. So this is your course adjuster for your clutch, this end. So what we're going to do, we're just going to take the Allen screws out. So this is just the outer cover. It's 3 of these. These sometimes can be cheese-headed screws or Allen screws, depends what it's had replaced in the years of its life. These gearboxes are easy to work on really. Once you've taken one apart and cleaned it all and reassembled it, and just go by your diagrams in your manual, you can't really go wrong really. Like that just holds the assembly for the speedo, so you don't have to really worry about that. And try and get your washers off as you take it apart really, because they can hang up when you pull the case off. Give it a tap. We have got a little bit of oil coming out of this. It hadn't drained down completely, so we've just put something underneath that. Now, okay. Use a plastic hammer, just keep tapping, it will come off alright. We're going to replace the gaskets in here anyway. So what we've got behind here, we have our kickstart gear, claw, then we have the return spring, and here is the speedo drive worm gear that runs off the lay shaft and gearbox. Here is the selector cam, so that's all that's in that first cover. I showed you just now, it has a course adjustment here
bit more toward camera. Yep.
You can adjust your push rod, the course adjustment here, and also reposition if you have to for any reason. This whole assembly comes off a spline on this arm, and you can reposition that. These are a nice gearbox. We will check when it's clean that there's no cracks or anything, everything's in good order. That is your selector paw assembly. So the next bit we need to do, this is the kickstart ratchet. Now these gears we've shown these before on the A65, they get rounded, so that would be replaced. The back gear, this part here is okay, but this is what gets all the wear and tear. So it's just on the tab, we undo that, and then we have some inner screws. In fact, we've just got just the one screw there, then we can take this away. We check to see what sort of wear we got here on these bushes. So that one is bad, so that will need to be replaced, and that's with oil around it. So you can see how much movement you can get. This is the ball race bearing up the top here. So gearboxes are such an important part to take apart. People just assume, you know, engine work, but you need to take your gearbox down. Before we go any further, we check the high gear, sleeve gear, and we take the main shaft that goes through the gearbox. We make sure there's no movement up and down. We see a little bit of chipping around where the clutch inner drive assembly will go. This happens a lot. We just probably put a new key in it or make an oversized key. It's where the adapter for the clutch sits, and we're going to put a Triumph clutch on here now anyway. But as we take it down, we can then check a few more bits. I can see from here that the circlip isn't fitted properly. It's working its way out. In here, it's coming out. So there's a few things that aren't quite right. So we just take the tab off. Okay, so I've just tapped back this tab on here. It's an unusual washer, but it's okay. Normally they just have a washer from BSA that I've got cut the tabs and use one of them, and the other one for spare, but it's got loads on here. So we need to undo the nut. There is oil still coming out the gearbox. I had this on the bench and had leaked out oil, and I thought most of it already come out, but I was caught out. The drain plug that you want to undo, always undo your plug first and take it out, then mount it up in your vise. It's easy to work with a vise, it holds it in the right place. So we just take that tab washer off and the nut, make sure we're going the right way. I use an air gun because it's easier. It shouldn't be that tight really, but you've got an air gun, it does make it easier because it's holding on to the shaft the other end, which could be an issue. We've shown this before, so replace this gear here. It's quite cheap. This doesn't really wear, it shouldn't do. So behind here we have a bush and a spring. That should come off. And you can reassemble it because that will go in the back of there. Then you don't lose anything. Keep it all together. And right at the back, got a washer. We've got one screw, and then we can pull the gearbox apart. And again, now we just tap this off with a plastic hammer. Okay, this is your inner cover. Normally on here there's a dot of red paint. It will then line up your selector when you put it back together, but we'll talk about that another time. This bearing, we just make sure that this bearing is in good order, that the circlip's in the groove correctly. This bush here is worn quite badly, so we had to replace this one. As I said, the difference between the RR2 TRRT2 gearbox and the standard box is the racing box has a needle bearing and the standard box has a bronze bush. That's really the main differences. So what we can do now, we can start taking out parts of the gearbox now. So we can take this gear off here, which is on the lay shaft. Lay shaft is the second shaft. Take the gasket off. We will replace these anyway. Let's get it out of the way. So to get this apart, we pull this rod out of the way. This rod is held in the back of the gearbox with a grub screw. Once you take this selector rod out, then your gears will come out with the selectors in place, the fork selectors. That's it, okay. So we just need to take the screw out. Normally what happens is they get a bit bashed around. People sometimes put a chisel mark in here so it won't undo itself. I normally just put the screw in fairly tight, not over tight, a little bit of silicone. Then you can just pull the silicone out as in when over time and undo the screw. So if you chisel over that case, this now has got a cut back through the aluminium on the way out. You can see it just tears a bit off. Best thing to do is put that screw in a bag. Then that rod will push out. We'll put that in the cover for the moment. So what we're checking here, we're taking this first gear off, which works on the back of the kickstart mechanism here. We can see on here there's quite a lot of scoring going on this lay shaft, really bad. So that isn't a good shaft. So what we can do now, we can get this rod out and pull that out. Just make a bit of space. Now, all this lot here will come out now. Just carefully pull out. That's the first one. You've got two of these selector dogs in here. We'll take out the main shaft. Now what we can see straight away is we've got a certain amount of scoring, possibly, but we're going to have a closer look in a moment. We're looking for chip teeth, like here.
Show camera.
We're getting a little bit of bashing going on here, just a little bit of bashing. You get a certain amount because it's a crash gearbox, but we're just making sure it's not really bad. You can see where it's done quite a bit of work, this gearbox. Here's a standard box. So we put the main shaft there, and now we just pull out that selector fork, well, selector dog I should say. Take him off. We give this a good clean up. The first thing we do is just have a quick visual look at all the gears, see what sort of condition they're in. Where there is wear is here. We have a lot of scoring along here. You put your fingernail along here. That's probably why it's worn that bush out. So we'll probably try and replace this shaft here, get a better one for it. Also we check the running in the back bush. The top hat bushes are easy to replace, but we just put that back in, take the gears off, and just put it into the back of the box. You can see this, obviously it's not supported this end, but there's a lot of movement. But we go through each gear. Once it's cleaned down, we just check all the splines. This part isn't so bad. These gears don't look bad at all. But it's quite worn here on that shaft. So what else has got to come apart in the gearbox? Well, we call it the sleeve gear, the high gear. Now that'll just push out from the back. Just have to give that a tap out. So that just tap through. And what we tend to look here for, we can see this bush doesn't look brilliant. Sleeve gear bushes, they're in pairs. They're pushed in, two of those, one from each side. Usually get wear, it's okay, but it hasn't been installed that well. You can see it's been bashed in a little bit, really. Your best way to put these in is with a press. Something in there, don't want to drift it in. It's been drifted in a little bit. It's okay, but just a little bit of damage on the outside. The spines are good and the teeth are good. We're not too worried about this, we can sort that out, but we're more worried about the lay shaft because it has got a bit of wear in it. I might have got another one here that's better because it's only standard, but we definitely need to replace the bushes. And you can see there's a certain amount of like bronze and contamination in the box. This here is your selector cam plate. Now on the later gearboxes you can reverse this. You can take the detent from the bottom as it looks here and put it up here. Normally there's a plug on the later gearboxes, but you can't on this one, and that's why we reverse the cam plates on the Gold Star or Rocket Gold Star, and basically it's put in from the other way. Instead of the gears as this one is, one down and three up, they're usually one up and three down when it's on an RGS or a Gold Star. So yeah, there's not a lot to worry about. It's a good clean out. There's an inspection cover here that's quite useful for when you're building the box up. Take that off, look in there. But we need to take these bushes out. We check also, the thing that I've noticed, and I'll show you, I'll just take it out of the vise and turn it round. Important thing here is this circlip. You can see here, it's quite a sprung circlip here, it's not in the groove. It's fitted back in there, but here it's almost out, and I'll show you in a minute. I'll just put that here. So you have to be you have to be pretty thorough at some things, well most things really, because you don't know who's built it, you need to go through it properly. Yeah, and also drain the oil before you take your box apart. But we'll just take that circlip out and I'll just show you, it will just fly out. So with these, usually with a screwdriver, just get in there. That's it, they just ping out. Because that wasn't in properly, we should be able to pull out the oil seal. What happens with these, they can go hard and they leak, and sometimes they don't seal particularly well, because this, shown before, they sometimes have this bit of a rib going around here. I had to flatten these off in the past and put silicone around there. But if you get our sprocket, and I put the sprocket on there, so what's important to make sure that your seal is in good order, because when the gearbox sprocket is on, it needs to be a good fit on there. That isn't particularly good. It's not gripping it at all, really. So we replace that anyway. And said before, you're looking for hook teeth. This one will be replaced. It's just starting to go home a bit. Getting quite sharp on the ends. They go sharp and they start to go out of shape. So yeah, a little bit on that gearbox. So we're looking at replacing lay shaft. We're looking at replacing oil seal, gaskets, bushes. So yeah, something that mustn't be overlooked. Gearbox. That bearing also. We always get these out by putting that in the oven, get it nice and hot, and they just drop out. But take it out and give it a good clean, because you get contamination behind the back of the bearing. So it's always a good idea to drop the bearing out, wash it all out. So yeah, something that does always need looking at, gearbox. If you're doing an engine rebuild on a pre-unit, take it apart. With a unit construction engine, you'll be taking the gearbox apart anyway. But it's just false economy to think, oh, the gearbox is okay, and find out when you ride the bike it's noisy and leaks oil and has all sorts of problems. Usually they whine in third gear if they're bad. So that's that really. So we need to clean that up, and then we can make a proper list of what we need for it. Okay, so we've got the engine apart. This is the BB34. The BB ZB 350 500, early generation Gold Star, first generation really. They were different from what you think of as Gold Star, like the DB34. It's slim barrel. The pushrod tunnel is different. You see the coat of arms. It's more like a B31 or 33. Good engine. But what we found, removed the cylinder head. What we've got to remember is it came in, had various leaks, and didn't have a lot of compression. I should have just checked the valve clearances, taken it apart, but I just rattled the head off. The head gasket on here is a composite one that's been used a few times. It's pretty crushed up, not very good, and this is where it's been leaking from the head, but more than that. So the composite gasket will sit on the head. Now we have a liner here, cylinder liner. We have composite gasket. Then we have the cylinder head. But if you notice, it's very black around here. And what has been happening, I think it's been leaking from the head, because the liner sits up too proud. It should recess into the head, like a top hat in here, but that is deeper than it should be. So if we put the head on there without the gasket, there's quite a big gap. So if I show you, let's put it around the right way. Just find that. Now that head's on there. If you look down in there, there is quite a gap round here. Now this composite gasket has been pulled right up, and I don't think that's really been doing a great deal. So it's something you've got to get checked out. I think there's too much exposure of that liner. It may well have not been fitted properly, because it's obviously been relined, and I think there should be more skirt at the bottom showing. It has got a bit of scoring. It's been running on a oversized piston.
Give us a look in there, mate.
But this is just as we took it apart. There's quite a lot of scoring marks.
Bit up toward more up toward the camera. Yeah, have a look through.
You can see honing marks in there, but you can see score marks.
Just tip him. Yeah.
So that needs to be looked at. The next thing we noticed when we took the head off Now I left the piston on the conrod. I'm just showing you how I've done it. I just got some gasket paper and made sure I didn't damage the piston, because I didn't want to take it off and say to you afterwards it was incorrect, because you would say, well, you got it off. But to show you how it really is. Now we know this is the drive side, so that is your, as you ride a bike, that is your right hand side. This is drive side, left hand side. So the piston should be, the arrow should be facing towards me, because I'll be the front. This is now facing backwards. I can't see it make a great deal of difference, but the piston's on the wrong way around. Also, this piston has been altered in quite a big way here. It's been ribbed out. Now, probably it's done to trap the oil, but I don't think it's a very good idea, really. There seems to be a lot of surface area in contact with the barrel. There's a lot of scoring. This is certainly picked up in several places here. Should only be the rings in contact, really, but I don't like the look of this piston. So I think we're really looking at possibly the liner being sorted out with a proper piston for it. So that's not quite right. Now, when we split the crankcases, we found that it has an inferior bearing, a bearing on one end of the crank, and it was around the wrong way. Now the cases are here. So on our timing side, we have a bearing in this case here, just a single bearing. And this bearing, this is a cheap bearing. Now, it so happens I've got one that's been replaced in the past, so I can show you. When the bearing goes in the case is warmed up in the oven, you drop the outer race into the case itself. So it leaves the open side for the roller bearing to go in. When that's mounted onto the crankshaft, it should go on with the flange here onto the crank. And then when it's on the crankshaft and you put it all together, it goes back into that race that way round. Like that. If we look at this bearing, it's been put on the wrong way around. So that isn't right. So this is what should be in contact with the crankshaft, up against the stub of the crank, and it is the wrong way around. It should be that part of the bearing. So that was wrong. So we're going to put a better quality bearing in there. We've got the oil pump to take off in a moment. We'll show you that as well. On the other side of the crankcase, it has a more substantial bearing. It has two bearings, in fact. And I can show you the bearings that run in there. The outer bearing is a conventional ball race bearing, and this bearing here is a more substantial bearing. It fits on the crankshaft for chain in a moment with that spacer and the bearing, and the distance piece here. Good heavy bearing. But this cage bearing that's on this end, they're not brilliant. They're quite a cheap bearing, so we're going to get a better quality bearing to go back when we put this back together. We're going to show you how we check to make sure the crank isn't damaged. Now, what can happen with a crank? We're going to do we'll show you various things in a moment. I don't wipe my hands because everything's, as it took it apart, nothing's been cleaned up yet. We can see here it's got loads of vice jaw marks, and that's not good to start with. It's been bashed about, obviously, someone trying to get the flywheel to run through, the flywheel wheels, basically. And that's been clobbered with a hammer quite a few places, been bruised. But it's also been in vice jaws here. So when you turn that round, there's quite a lot of strike marks here, which is not a good sign. You wouldn't want to leave it like that. It doesn't look good. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this crank in the vise so you can see how we check it. we're not nipping it tight, we just put the flywheel assembly back into a vise and make sure the piston's okay, out the way. Now what can happen with Gold Star crankshafts is because the stubs, the crankshaft stubs, they're actually riveted. They're not bolted. I mentioned once before in a video by mistake, they're actually riveted up. Okay, so you have the flywheels, you have the stubs, and you'll see there's a flange here and these rivets going around. Now here, there's an oil way that goes through the crankshaft, and oil will get to the big end. So it'll lubricate your centre bearing there. Okay, so what we do, we get something like WD-40, use your straw extension, and you get as much in there as you can. And then we put an airline behind it. Just put a bit more in because it's probably come out a little bit. Now what we're checking for now is leakage. Now if you look down here, you see bubbles. There's a crack. Now if we just blow that away, so where this flange is on here, there's a crack appearing. Now we're just going to squirt a bit more in there and see if you can see it from anywhere else. It's a bit of a messy job. Mind your camera because you're right, it might spray back a bit. If we look right down in here, try and show you where it is. In there,
yeah, I got that.
We have a crack. That's the start of a crack that will carry its way around. What can happen, they can snap. And someone who's well known for rebuilding Gold Stars, and I won't mention his name because he's retired now, I can say his first name, Phil, showed me this a long time ago. He said the best check you can do is use WD-40 or something like that, squirt it up the oil way in the crank, then put an airline behind it, and that will show up straight away if there is any damage there. This is the third one I come across. So what I would suggest the customer replace this. We go for a pressed up crank assembly, so that it'll be the flywheels, stubs, it's all been pressed up, it won't be riveted up, and a more modern rod on there, a Gorilla rod probably. Because this is the heart of the Gold Star, this is not right. And when they were, when they were racing these, they used to be pulled apart and checked quite regularly. Something like about, I don't know, 500 miles or something like that if they were racing these things, or thereabouts, and then checked. It's either 500 hours, I don't think it's 500 hours, but I think it's 500 miles of hard use, and then they will be checked. So yeah, that is quite important to do that, because what would be the point in rebuilding all this and leaving this crank in there? Because potentially that's going to get worse, and if he rides it as you can ride a Goldie fairly quick, this is could be a problem. It certainly won't get any better. But that crack there, it can happen anywhere around. It doesn't necessarily go there, but that is the start of a more major problem. So yeah, there is quite a bit of work on this one to do, not only gearbox but engine as well. So you've got to do it right. Magneto, well, that's straightforward enough. We'll have the dynamo on the bench, and we're doing unregulated output on that, like we've done before with the matchless. We'll have the armature out the mag, we'll clean it all up and make sure we get a good spark, and we go from there really, basically. Another good thing to check is where you have the oil pump feed and return. These unions that fit, I'll just show you if I can. So we have, just get the right ones really, in the right direction. You can see what I'm talking about here. Now this plate here goes inside the timing case. This is where the crankshaft runs. There's a spring washer there, a star washer and a nut, and you have these unions here. Now they need to be a good fit into these rubbers here. If they're not, you can get leakage of oil, and they've gone hard and don't fit at all well. That's something they get overlooked. Always need to undo these from here obviously and put them in there and just see what they fit like. It should be nice and snug. So you lose a lot of oil pressure through that. So something else needs to be done. Replace those. These are, I mean, basically a Gold Star engine is quite straightforward. The bottom end doesn't look any different from a B31, B33 really. But they ported it and they've done a lot more work. This isn't in a heavy state of tune because we look at the inlet and we can see it's not over large. It's a conventional carburetor on here. It does run fairly big valves. We do check the guides, and what I've done straight away, and I'll show you, we'll take the exhaust valve, which would be this one here, because it's dark, and we always check to make sure there's not any wear here. You can feel it with a fingernail. Look at that first. We look at the seat of the valve. Look, as we've shown you before, any damage here on the stem. Then what we do is we put the valve back into the guide and we're checking for movement. Some movement's tolerable, and this isn't bad, but it's something that we might replace because it's a Gold Star. So if we change that guide on this one, we'll probably change the valve as well. But you do need to be thorough, and everything needs a really good clean. The other thing what we do, we just check the gears. We have here, we got the intermediate gear here, and we have the pinion gear, it drives off the crankshaft, and we've got the two camshafts, got the inlet and exhaust, and we'll make sure that it has got the right cams that go with this model, and that the lobes are okay. So that's something else we need to do, just check that through. So everything needs a good thorough clean and a really good examination. So we've spoken about the engine and the gearbox, had those both down. Now taking the bike apart, removing the primary chain case, we notice here we've got epoxy filler. So we're going to knock this out of here, take that out, and we'll take this to somebody that can do the welding for us. In this case it'd be a Zat Weld. They'll help us out on this. We're also going to replace the BSA clutch. We'll put a Triumph clutch in there, as we mentioned before, and we're going to put back on the Amel monoblock carburetor. So yeah, there is a lot to do, and all the things like all the tab washers and locking devices, that we check them all, replace them, the ones that are worn, so everything will be in good order. So we need to do a list for the customer, get it all priced up, and we go from there. Okay, so the Rocket Gold Star. This one, say it has got matching numbers, and it is going to be up for sale. It does need a tidy up. The engine is running. We need to install the battery and the clamp. But I'm just going to fire it up for you so you can hear it. quite a sweet engine. We're just going to check the clutch, make sure that the centre nut is tight on the main shaft. But she runs really well. I think with a good clean up, that'd be nice. Running a touring trim, so we've got the higher bars on here. It hasn't got shrouds, it's got gaiters, but I think it's quite a desirable bike. And it has actually got the RR-T2 gearbox, so it's a close ratio gearbox in this one. And if Alex has a look, you can see the stamping on the casing. It is the correct casing stamping. Hey, mate. This one twitters. Not very often you get an RGS that would twitter. A quiet engine, nice engine. That was rattling about on the bench, so taking that off. So hopefully within a few days we'll have it all cleaned up and we'll have it actually ready for sale. So we will let you know as soon as it's ready. And I think the customer out there waiting for this one. It's a good one.